So welcome everybody to this webinar of the Green Carpenter Bee. I'm really delighted to be able to share with you this webinar today. It's a pretty exciting webinar. I've been involved in this program for about 18 months now. I was in the car driving to a conference and I happened to stumble across a radio station and I heard Katja Hogendoorn talking. And she was talking about bees and pollination and saying a whole range of things that I just really agreed with. And I remember really hearing a very important message as she was talking about the Green Carpenter Bee Conservation Project. And what she said on that was, we know how to save the Green Carpenter Bee and we need just a little bit of money, but we need that money for the next 20 years if we're going to be able to save this bee. So I got on the phone the next day, I think it was, to Katja and introduced myself as the CEO of the Wheen Bee Foundation and said, look, you know, I liked what I heard, and I'd like to be able to help. So that began a relationship between the Wheen Bee Foundation and this project. In about August last year, I had the pleasure to go to Kangaroo Island and spend some time with the three speakers we're going to hear from today. And I was in the field, saw what they were doing, and it meant that the foundation was able to really just get behind, promote the project. And we've been able to raise some significant funds to really help this project. Obviously, the bushfires in January were a huge heartache. And so really today's webinar is about sharing the information about the history of the project, the conservation of the Green Carpenter Bee on Kangaroo Island, and hear from the researchers and the project leaders about where they're up to now and how they've responded to the bushfires and what the future holds. So I'm delighted to be a great promoter of this project. I'm inviting Dr. Richard Glatz to join us. Richard's an entomologist. Richard is going to be the first speaker. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Fiona.
So Richard's an entomologist based on Kangaroo Island, and he's got plenty of experience in the field of entomology. You can see all of his specimen drawers behind him there for all of the, I think it was 600,000 species of insect you have there. Pretty impressive. So Richard's going to speak to us today and share his knowledge. So thanks very much, Richard, and over to you.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. Alrighty, yeah, thanks everyone for coming along today to hear a story about this great animal, the Green Carpenter Bee. Yeah, story about where it used to be, where it is now, fires and conservation. Yeah, I'll speak first and you'll hear from Remko and Katja, my colleagues who have worked on Carpenter Bee for a long time coming up. So what I'm actually going to do is just give some background about the Carpenter Bee, some of its biology and some of the historical information about where it used to occur. So if we look at Carpenter bees in general, so that's the genus Xylocopa. There used to be several genera that made up carpenter bees, but they've all been put now under Xylocopa. So that's, you can basically say that's carpenter bees now. Globally, there's about 750 species of these things. And they're called carpenter bees because they've got the ability to actually chew through wood themselves and excavate their own nests. So many bee species actually use holes in wood to nest, but most of them, almost exclusively, they use holes that exist, but the carpenter bee actually can chew them out because they're quite large bees generally and have strong mandibles. So that's where they get their name. Yeah, and globally they use a variety of species of plant to nest in and for nutrition with pollen and nectar. And in the USA, there's a particularly well-known species, Xylocopa virginica, and that actually can bore in intact, hard structural timber like you find in houses. So there, in that context, they're actually a pest, and you can see there on the bottom picture, that's a trap type that exists there to catch these things and stop them boring in houses. In Australia, this doesn't happen. They basically stick to several species of plant in native vegetation to nest in, and these plants have pithy wood, especially when combined with fungal degradation. Okay, so the species I'm going to talk about today is Green Carpenter Bee, Xylocopa aurata. Yeah, it's iconic, beautiful, big bee. You don't see them often, but yeah, it would be significantly larger than a honeybee, probably 2 centimeters, a little bit more maybe. The male's down here with yellow hairs and yellow markings on its face, and this is the female here. Yeah, and for a bee, they're actually quite long-lived. So the female would probably live for about a year. So if you compare that to, say, a honeybee, they live, except for the queen, they live a lot less. So that's quite long for a bee. And they're solitary. So what they actually do is one mother makes her own nest and looks after her own offspring. So they don't have offspring helping. Basically, the mother looks after her own offspring in their own nest and separate from other bees, although they do gather nearby often. They've got a complex mating behaviour, so the males compete and the females seem to assess the males for which ones they'll mate with. And an important ecological aspect of the carpenter bees is that they do buzz pollination. So the normal pollination you'd be familiar with is where a bee lands on a flower, and basically the parts of the body of the bee fit the flower and the bee gets pollen on it, therefore, and goes to another flower to feed and transfers the pollen. But in buzz pollinating or plants that need buzz pollination, many Australian species, the pollen's actually inside the anther and a bee has to come up and vibrate the anther at high speed, and the anther basically explodes the pollen out onto the bee. So yeah, many Australian plants need that. You can see bush tomatoes, hibbertia, fringe lilies all need that sort of pollination, and they've co-evolved with native Australian bees that do that. Yes, so it's also worth noting that the honeybee does the first form of pollination, I said, where its body just fits flowers. Yeah, so they can't pollinate flowers like this. It requires specialised bees. And yeah, the carpenter bee is a good example of that. Okay, so the problem we've got with it is that there's a huge contraction or attraction of its natural range historically. So it used to occur right across this area here where there's spots of its occurrence from records. Yeah, but where these red dots occur is where we now think it is extinct. And it's actually been a long time since it's been found here. So mainland South Australia in the Mount Lofty Ranges here, down the southeast, hasn't been seen for well over a century. In Victoria in 1938 was the last time it was seen. So that's quite an area where it's become extinct from. So there's several things to note about that. Firstly, it now is only at the extremities of its former range. Yeah, so it's in 2 disjunct populations that are widely separated, and that most of the area where the black dots occur was burnt less than a year ago. So that's put a significant pressure on this species now, and Katja and Remko will talk about that later on. So now on Kangaroo Island, where we're working, yeah, it's only in the west of Kangaroo Island. And so what we think is the cause of these extinctions is habitat clearing and fragmentation, plus large or frequent burns, leads to a loss of nest substrate in the burn, obviously, and an inability to recolonize the burnt areas from fragmentation. So if you've got no nearby populations that can get back in, you've effectively lost the species. So that's what we think's happened across this area historically. So we can basically link a fire loosely to one extinction. So the last time they were seen, as I said, was in 1938 in Victoria. And then in January 1939, Black Friday occurred and the entire Grampians was burnt and the bee was never seen in that area again. So probably what we think happened was all the nest substrate was lost from this area and there were no populations nearby that could get back in. So we can see that fire and the availability of populations in the near vicinity are crucial to the survival of this insect and how the loss of that can compromise it. Okay, so quickly, if we look at its life cycle, firstly, 2 things to note: it's annual, so this just happens over 1 year, and the bee has a very low reproduction rate. So young adults become active just a while ago in early spring when the weather warms up. So on Kangaroo Island, it's roughly October. We then get males competing for females and they die after mating. And then females begin to excavate nests. Some of them use pre-existing nests and they'll construct tunnels and brood chambers. And that happens basically in the summer. And we can see down here in the bottom left, this is tunnels here and brood cells that the mother has dug out and constructed. So if we look at a brood cell close up, what happens is the mother makes the tunnel, makes a small area where she puts a pollen ball. She'll lay an egg on it and then she'll seal it with sawdust-like material from where she's chewed out the chamber, the tunnel. So what you get is a series of these brood cells in tunnels. So an important thing about this is that the cell at the far extremity of the tunnel was made first. And so this insect will mature first and then has to get out. So there's a limit to 3 or 4 in a tunnel before there's too many bees and the maturation gets too staggered, I guess. And yeah, these bees can't get out. So they're basically, the mother has to dig all this out of the wood. She has to make these cells, provision them. There's a limit on how many you can have in the tunnels. Yeah, and so the mother basically has only 2 or 3 months to do that. So the combination of these things means that the reproduction rate is pretty low and you wouldn't get much more than what's here per year for one mother. What that also means is that you've got to have an overlap of generations. The mother looks after the young in the nest. And so, yeah, you've got to have the mother there when the young are there at the same time. And that also puts a limit on the breeding of these insects. Yeah, and the mother looks after the young adults in the nest and then dies when the weather cools down. And then the young bees become inactive then until the weather warms up again and things start again. Okay, so the Green Carpenter Bee and fire. It's a very complex relationship. There's a clear benefit to the carpenter bee and there's also a clear threat depending on a whole bunch of variables. The 4 I want to think about today are the carpenter bees themselves, banksia plants, which they nest in, and yucca or grass trees that they nest in as well. They nest in the flowering spikes of these. And of course, fire. This is Ravine de Casors, not long after the fire this year, and there's large areas of southwestern Kangaroo Island that look like this. There's also obviously other variables like other plants that they need to feed on, because these are nesting plants. But yeah, these are the 4 I want to really consider today. Okay, so a few things to think about is that the carpenter bees actually nest in dead wood. So I'll talk a little bit more detail about that in a minute. But yeah, basically where they nest burns easily. They only use several types of dead wood, so they're very picky. They use dead banksia trunks and the dead yucca flower spikes. So that's why I showed those plants. And the availability of both is related to fire in several ways. And the bees also need flowers basically the year round to provision the nest, keep adult bees healthy. Yeah, so they need also flowers in the landscape. It's not enough just to have a nesting substrate. Okay, so the first substrate type I'll talk about is the xanthorrhea or the grass tree or yucca. So one thing that's very obvious about these plants is that fire promotes flowering, and these flower stalks are what the bee actually uses. So there's great areas of Kangaroo Island now that look like this picture where there's numerous flower spikes. Yeah, there's very, very many, and they flower for a few years after fire. And then the thing about the bee is it can only nest in, if you look on the right here, it can't nest in these spikes here because they're still green and alive. What has to happen is that they die off, and the next year or maybe the year after, they become available. So you can see here a carpenter bee entrance hole in a yucca spike, but that yucca would have flowered a year or 2 before. So these spikes have to dry, and then basically they only stay on the plant for several years and then just fall over. So they provide basically abundant habitat in the short term for the bee. The other type that they use is Banksias. Banksia marginata is actually the preferred Banksia. You can see here its occurrence in Australia in green basically overlaps, except for Tasmania, where the bee doesn't occur, overlaps with the carpenter bee. Yeah, we found that's the Banksia that the carpenter bee prefers on Kangaroo Island. If we look at fire and these Banksias, basically fire will kill the Banksia. And now if fire kills the Banksia and the Banksia is still intact and standing, maybe 5 to 8 years after fire, that Banksia will become usable. The trunk will become usable. That generally happens in quite low percentage of the Banksias. And what we find is a better situation for the bees really is where the Banksias are very common and they've died through old age. The thing about that is you're looking 30 to 50 years after a fire generally. It's these areas, these old areas of Banksia that seem to support stable and long-term populations. So the Banksias are there for a long time. The bees are there in one spot for a long time and can move out into yakka substrate that's much more temporary. Also, when you consider Banksia, the seed release and the germination is fire responsive. So you actually get new Banksias growing from fire. They don't flower for 10 or 15 years. So this is important in terms of maintaining Banksias in an area. And if fires are too frequent, losing them. And eventually they die, they dry, they lose branches, they acquire white rot, and they're ready for bees to use. And you can see down here a carpenter bee in a Banksia trunk blocking the entrance. Okay, so this graph is kind of this hasn't actually been measured with real numbers. But we kind of know what happens in terms of the trend. So it's a hypothetical graph of substrate becoming available after a fire at a site. So you get a fire, what you've got is some Banksia that are already there, that are remnant Banksia in whatever numbers they're there in. You get a fire, which should be back here a bit actually, and that knocks back basically everything to zero. But soon after the fire, as I said, you get grass tree increasing in large numbers, but only lasting for a while. You then get smaller numbers of Banksia that were killed in the fire that were mature and are left standing. You get a period through here where there's only sporadic flowering of the yakka, and there's low substrate availability. And then you get Banksias that have got old enough to get big enough and then died, and they start to go up. But this is a long-term thing and can actually stretch out many years. So we found some of the best populations prior to the fire were in 80-year-old, 90-year-old country. So we think that old growth country is quite important for carpenter bees. So if you have a large fire, a problem is that you reduce variation in the substrate availability across the landscape. So if the whole landscape looks like this, you've got problems because you're going to have a time when there's no substrate here at all and very little here. Whereas if this is happening at smaller spatial scales across the landscape, you start to get a mix-up of this trend, and you get lots of different substrate availabilities across the landscape. And that's probably what the carpenter bee needs, we think. Okay, so we knew it was declining historically, and in 2003, the question was asked, well, where is the green carpenter bee actually still on Kangaroo Island? And so a roadside survey was performed. So all these red lines here are the roads that were searched for the green carpenter bee. And basically where they found them, sorry about that, were where the black dots occur. So the black dots are basically Banksia and grass tree nests. There's some red dots on there. I don't know how well you can see them. Here and here in the east of Kangaroo Island. That were historic records, and some of them you can see the bees weren't found there again, so there's no black dot near them. And another thing to think about is that the yellow areas where it's suitable for the carpenter bee, and in the west here is where most of the population occurred and where there's large intact areas of its habitat. And elsewhere on the island, I mean, Kangaroo Island's got a reputation for being kind of a wilderness and having these large intact areas, and certainly in the west and the south it does, but a lot of Kangaroo Island, especially through here, looks like anywhere else, and up here has good vegetation, but it is highly fragmented. So apart from these large conservation areas, the Carpenter Bee habitat is highly fragmented on Kangaroo Island, and essentially that's moved its populations historically west. So most of the records now are from the west. Yeah, and as I said, it's highly fragmented. So really that sets the scene, that's the background, and sets the scene then for a further large fire some years later in 2007. Some research and conservation efforts that we undertook after that, and then the recent large fire that we had again, and Katja and Remko will elaborate on that. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming along, and I'll pass it back to Fiona.
Thanks very much, Richard. So I'd like to introduce to you now Remko Leijs. Remko has been did his PhD on carpenter bees worldwide, so he's very, very experienced on carpenter bees as a leading global expert on carpenter bees. So we're very lucky to have him working on the green carpenter bees on Kangaroo Island. And he's been working with them since about 1996, and since 2002, really looking at that complex relationship between the green carpenter bee population and bushfires, and how that relates with the fragmentation and habitat destruction. So because of the work that Remko has done, particularly in identifying a way of producing artificial nesting substrates, Remko was awarded a special science prize in recognition of just how significant that achievement was. So thanks, Remko. I'd like to invite you now to share with us some of your information. Thanks, Remko.
Yes, so Richard already talked about some of the surveys that we did. So I'll skip over that. Yeah, so this is a sort of the model that sort of came out of the first survey, where we looked at the relationship between the carpenter bees and fire. Historical fire and different ages, and so that's sort of how we got that information. And so I'll just recoup that a little bit. So you got after a fire, you get mass flowering of the grass trees, and they provide, after sort of between 3 and 8 years time, a large number of nest substrates in grass trees. Then you get a dip in that availability of nesting substrate, and then the banksia that are killed and became soft with the dry rots. And there's a relationship with the fire frequency. So if there's too many fires, then this dip or the peak in the banksia is much reduced. And so an important other thing to realize is that after about 15 to 16 years, after a burn, there's no substrate in the environment left, and for a long period. And so Richard already mentioned that banksias need to grow, and in long-term unburned areas, you'll get a natural die-off of a banksia, and that provides a sort of a long-term nest substrate for the bees, and that's actually the most important area. So we need to take care of those. Yeah, so the second survey that we did was a number of years after the whole Flinders Chase National Park burned down. So that is this orange bit on the western side of Kangaroo Island. And yeah, so we just wanted to know what would happen. So the results of this survey was, so I'll start with the good news, is that we found old nests in grass trees, yucca, all the way to West Bay, which is the furthest west of the island. And we also saw some fresh nests in Banksia. So we found a source population of the bees, and that was just east of Flinders Chase National Park, which was an area which was long-term without burning. This survey also we used, there were newspaper articles and people helped us with surveying. So it was good because it sort of got the attention of the public. The bad news, however, was that the density of the yucca trees was very low, because we were at this time of the sort of about almost 6 years after the fire, and also Banksia substrate was very low in this Flinders Chase National Park, particularly because of the frequent burns. So the prospects for a near future nest substrate were very slim, and because of the frequent fires, the Banksia died too young. They were usually too small to be suitable for the bees, and in some places there was very limited regeneration because the areas got burned before the seed bank could be replenished. And so far, during that survey, we did not find other source populations. So we realized that the most important thing here is to create new nest substrates for the bees, particularly to bridge that long period where there's no substrate at all. So, yeah, possible things you can do. We thought, well, you can do small-scale control burns at a place where there's a high density of grass trees. But of course, there's a problem here because you don't have an immediate effect, because it takes at least 3 years for there would be substrate in those areas. And also, if this would be the management way to do that, you need to continue to do this, but there's no resources for environmental fire management. So, and at the same time, it sounds a bit silly to do controlled burns that can go out of hand, and also in areas where you try to grow up long-term no fire for Banksia regrowth. So we came up with the idea to test artificial nest substrates to bridge this low density of substrate. So we already had some experience with artificial nest substrates by using observation nests, and you can see here a cross section of it. It's basically a balsa wood being stuck to a plywood, and then you've got a layer of perspex and some insulation material, and so this is a cross section with the entrance here, and basically we provide a little bit of a burrow that is populated with bees collected in the winter from hibernation nests. And the idea was that when you put those bees in there in the winter, in the spring they start doing their normal behavior and digging out nests, and so this was actually used to study mating behavior during my PhD in 1996, but it was very successful, and it even attracted bees from the environment, so mainly males. So in this frame you can see a number of individual nests been studied. So we use the same principle. Well, again, so it's to bridge the low density of substrate period. And we thought, well, if you provide so the bees that will learn to recognize this new substrate, especially bees that being grown up, grew up in those artificial nests. And at the same time, these observation nests are ideal for monitoring the breeding success and also in nest behavior, so you can actually see what's going on. So if this would have been successful, it provides and you provide ample substrate, you should increase population size, and then it may be even useful to harvest some nests for reintroductions at places where those bees disappeared. Okay, so the results of this artificial observation nests. So we placed those nests at 2 different sites, at Richard's property on Kangaroo Island and Flinders Chase. And so if you look at this graph here, so the initial 26 in Richard's place and 18 at Flinders Chase. So about, there was a big reduction in the number of nests where there was actually reproduction in, and even bees that overwintered in those nests was another reduction. And in the second year from the original 27, there were just 7 nests left. So what we found out by observations, there was actually nest switching, especially by males. And around 25% of the females disappeared before the spring, so they flew to another place. So we don't know. And to our disappointment, so the females did not use empty nests, but there was one exception. So in the new generation, a party does not hibernate in their own nest and probably disperse before the winter. But the good thing is with observation is you can make really nice pictures. So Richard showed those things already before. So this was part of the original tunnel, and the bees sort of extended that. You can see a large number of brood cells here, and they even dug a side tunnel with some more brood cells. And because you could sometimes not see all the burrows, we started using X-rays as well in the winter when all the bees hibernate in the nest. And you can see here a multi-tunnel nest with lots of adult bees. So the conclusions of using those observation nests, they were not as successful as hoped, because empty observation nests were almost never used. And there were lots of unknowns. So there was apparent it was bee dispersal, but we still don't know which sex disperses or when they disperse. And the other thing we really don't know is, so they didn't go into the empty nests. So what are the cues that females use to select substrate for new nests? So we've seen in the field that a female that are looking for a nest site can inspect a single banksia trunk for hours before she actually starts digging a nest. So we use that information to, maybe there's the banksia doesn't have a certain smell, so we use different extracts of banksia trunks and treated the artificial substrate with that, and tested the acceptance of treated and non-treated. And we also compared that with natural banksia trunks that we provided with a little pilot hole. So what we found was that there was it didn't make any difference or whether we applied extracts of banksia or not. But bees constructed nests in natural banksia trunks when we put a pilot hole in there. So we used basically that information to with a new approach. So by providing artificial substrates that are just mimicking the shapes of the grass tree flowering stalks and also banksia trunks. And they were made from balsa wood, which is soft enough for the bees to dig into. And we placed those substrate at different locations in Flinders Chase National Park. And to our great joy, that was very successful. So the bees found the substrates and they dug their own nest using from the pilot hole. And sometimes they also dug without a pilot hole. So yeah, so basically the method that we used, we set out new stalks in the winter, and then we also X-rayed older nests because so we could count the hibernating adults and measure tunnel length. And tunnel length is a proxy for the number of brood cells that are made in a nest. And in the summer, we checked the occupancy of a new nest that we placed in the field. So, so if you look at this graph here, so we have been doing this for 4 years already. We started in 2016. And so, so last year, we had almost a bit more than 50% success rate. So there were more than 302 nesting stalks and 155 nests. So yeah, we placed those at 7 different sites in Flins Chase National Park, on 2 sites on private properties. We just wanted to split the risk for when there was some bushfire. So we measured that there was about 4.5 new bees per nest. So, yeah, so that the fecundity is rather low, but it's still above. And what we found also was that the highest occupancy of those nesting stalks were at sites where there were no natural substrates. Well, an example of our carpenter bee of the X-raying. So we had a portable X-ray machine provided by some horse vets. And so on the back of the car, and so we placed a number of those nesting stalks, and so you can see a picture here with 5 of those nesting stalks, and you can see the overwintering bees and it's in multiple tunnels. And in 2019, there was one area that had not been burned for 60 years, and that really old banksia trunks, and basically the last remaining big trunks that had natural nests. We came in contact with Fiona basically, and also with other people that heard about the success of our conservation efforts, and so wanted to support this. And so it was supported by Sweden Entomological Society and with the Wheen Bee Foundation, and they managed to get an ANZ community grant, and we involved the Kangaroo Island Man Shed to build 800 of those nesting stalks for us. And so this was my part of the talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Remko. Can't help, when you were talking about the joy of your success, I can't help but feel that joy. And I was very happy to share in some of that joy when I spent some time in the field with you. So so thanks for sharing with that. It's just such an exciting project, and so great to see the progress that has been made. So Richard, we've had Richard talk to us about the relationship between the Green Carpenter Bee and fires. We've had Remko now talk to us about the conservation project and everything up to this point and the success that has been achieved. And now we're going to ask Katja to join us. So Katja Hogendoorn, as I said in the beginning, I first heard Katja speak on the radio and then reached out and asked if we could if Wheen Bee Foundation could help. Katja is a researcher of bees and crop pollination with the University of Adelaide, and has mostly been involved with the evolution of bees. She did her PhD also on carpenter bees, so another world expert on carpenter bees. So it's terrific to be able to have that experience with the project. So I'm about to invite Katja to talk to us about the future, where to from here. But can I just remind everybody that once Katja's finished, we will have some questions and answers. So please send your questions through on the Q&A function down the bottom, because I'd love to be able to have your questions that I can put through to our panel when Katja's finished. So thanks, Katja, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm really happy to be here. So we were so happy that this was working and that people were interested in it and the community was involved. And the bee was really was becoming really well known on the island. People were proud of it, and it was really very, very successful. And an uptake of 50–60% is very, very high, as people working on birds will probably know. So, and then of course the year 2020, which we all want to forget about, happened. And what basically happened on Kangaroo Island was this. The red area you see is the vegetation that got burned. And that caused enormous devastation on the island. I mean, people's houses, sheds, livestock burned, lives were lost. It was completely horrible. And what happened with the bees? Well, all our nest substrate, which are the yellow dots and the known nest, well, I haven't differentiated between the two, they were spread out over that area because that's the area where the bees occurred, right? And so they all got burned, which is devastating. And when I say burnt, yes, I mean really burnt, because this is basically what happened on Kangaroo Island, what it looked like soon after the burn, for the most part. And in May, we could go back to the island and we searched for our nests, of course, and what we found was burnt sticks. One nest was still standing, but there wasn't a bee in it. That was all that we could find, basically, of those 155 occupied nests, which was really tragic. But there is a more tragic side to this, of course. When you look at the 2007 burn, as Remko explained, we had these source areas that had old Banksia where the bees could come from and colonize the park. Well, compare that with 2020, most of those source areas are burnt. They are old Banksia forest that doesn't exist anymore. There's this rather small area now left that still has that. And when it comes to burnt Banksia, which we were talking about, which can be used by the bees after fire, in the park, that hadn't grown enough yet. It had only grown for 30 years after the 2007 fire, which was fairly big. And so this is what it looked like. So that burnt substrate isn't there in the park. So that was a loss of source population and no Banksia substrate at all. So that hit us more, I think, than losing all those observation nests. The fact that is there now hope for this bee? What can we do? So the Department of Environment of South Australia was very quick at funding a survey. And basically what they wanted to know, and what we wanted to know as well, is, are the bees still there? Where are they? And then later on, the Wildlife Recovery Fund from the Department of Agriculture came on board, and they want us to put out nesting stalks. So we had to decide, where do we place them? Where will they have the most benefit? And with this devastated landscape, is there enough food around for those bees at all? So the basic question that we're working on now is, can we save this bee for Kangaroo Island? And I will talk a little bit about what we found so far. This is quite recent, of course, because we've been to the island 3 times now for surveys. And surveys in the winter and spring of 2020, because the bees that are still there are in nests, or there is substrate out there. And so far, Richard, Remko and I have surveyed about 350 hours. And we got very many zeros, unfortunately. This is a real worry. It's either the area isn't suitable because there is no Banksia substrate, or because of soil unsuitability, or maybe because in the past it had burned too frequently so that Banksia couldn't flower. yet, and so there is no seed anymore. That's a possibility. So many zeros. However, we also found some areas where there are still nests present. And in one area up in the, let me see, the top here, we found a bee has been seen and photographed. So the main area indeed where we found bees is up the top here, right? This is area that hasn't burned since for about 60 years. That is where we find those old Banksia trunks still. So it is incredibly important to realize this. We only have found 23 nests so far, which isn't much, and those patches are now very, very precious. There aren't many of them. So we found one spot with grass trees that was burnt in 2015, and we placed a lot of nesting stalks there. We placed nesting stalks here so far, and a number of nesting stalks in the areas that still have Banksia. But it's important to realize that the bees prefer natural nesting substrate, if it is there, over our substrate. Right, they are. But so we don't know whether that's going to be used. So this is what we know so far. It's important to also look at this spot here, which is very close to where we put our nesting substrate at Richard's place. And that means really, because they haven't been seen here in our previous surveys, our 2005 surveys. So basically we have reintroduced the species here. So we did a translocation, which is hopeful, because that means that we can possibly, when we have bees in nesting stalks, that we can help them move, or even maybe reintroduce them. Those are important things. We've learned a lot over the years. We've learned how to make this nesting substrate, and we've learned how to do relocations if needed and possible, given the low numbers. So not all hope is gone. With the tiny Banksias that will not be suitable for the bees to nest in, it is still important to note that they have flowered. And when Banksia flowers, it releases its seed, as Richard has explained. And what you see on the bottom here is tiny, tiny Banksia seedlings. They will need 30 years to grow and die before they are somewhere near suitable for the bees. So we have to have patience. The other thing is that, of course, grass trees have been flowering everywhere. And next year or the year after, they are going to become available to the bees for nesting. So then there will be ample nest substrate. So the prognosis, which what we know now is, and now I'm going too fast, we will have very low numbers for the coming few years in unburnt areas. Then there will be plenty of grass tree stalks to nest in. So then we will know whether the population that is still left there is large enough to recolonize, or whether they suffer inbreeding depression, or population densities are just too low. We can't say that now. So there is hope. And then when all those grass tree stalks are going to fall down, that is when we will put in nesting stalk support. And we will need to do that for a long time coming. I won't probably see the Banksias that are coming in from regrowth and dying, because it takes too long. But it is still hopeful. Now you might say, well, the prediction is more and more intense fires. And right, you are, that is definitely the case. But that doesn't mean that we should be apathetic and do nothing. We can do a lot. We can do things locally, which is we can rapidly control incipient fires, survey them closely, and mount a large rapid response. And we are very happy that part of the outcome of the bushfire inquiry recommendations is indeed to do that, because that can save the carpenter bee. And on a global level, of course, we need to control climate change. We need to get rid of fossil fuels as fast as we can, and that means divesting from it. And also, and that's frequently forgotten, that alone is not enough. We got to actively reduce our CO2 levels, and that's by planting and using algae and other things to really take up that CO2. So that's what we need to do. But in the meantime, locally, what we are doing is finalizing our survey on Kangaroo Island and also New South Wales, where I haven't been talking about, putting nesting stalks on private properties, which we will do more of the coming year, when we have more of an idea where bees have been reproducing, and of course have a lot of community engagement in the protection of this species. Then next year we will monitor the use of from next year on, we will monitor the use of the natural grass tree stalks, assist recolonization very carefully if possible and needed, and then in 4 years' time we will be ready again to place and monitor nesting stalks. We will keep on asking the men's shed for help, because they did a fantastic job, and that was funded by the ANZ, so that was really money well spent, and so we now have all those nesting stalks to put out, but we will need to do that in the long future. And ongoing, we raise awareness about old forests. They are a very rare and very precious habitat, and we need to protect it. They contain fire vulnerable species. And of course, a lot of attention in Australia is always on the fact that the ecology has co-evolved with fire. Well, it's not the same for all the species, and definitely need not for Banksia and the species that depend on it. Yes, fire, Banksia needs fire, but it needs it at very, very low frequency. So we hope to make people aware of that. And any fuel reduction burns, any backburning will damage. So those precious few areas with old forest, we really need to protect them. And of course, what we will do is to keep going. We raise funds, and we're so grateful to Fiona for helping with this fundraising, because she made it work much larger. And so we like to thank all the people and all the organizations that have helped us to do what we have done, and that keep on helping us, and also a number of people, individual people, who really have been very, very helpful, and mostly also the very many volunteers and donors that have been involved in this. And of course, I'd like to thank you for being here and for caring about the Green Carpenter Bee.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Katja. And look, it's been an absolute delight to be part of this project. It is such an exciting project, and the enthusiasm of the three of you and then all of the other people that get involved in this project is just so clear to see. It's just a great project to be involved with. As you say, a number of people, since we got behind it 18 months ago, 12 months ago, a number of organisations are starting to come on board. You know, after ANZ, it was Flow, it was Sea Ecology, and so the numbers of supporters are really growing, which is fabulous to see. Now, we've got a couple of questions. We're just very short of time, so we might ask very quick answers. The first question I'll direct to Katja. It's to do with reintroduction. So 12 months ago, we were talking about the potential for reintroducing the Green Carpenter Bee to the mainland in the Grampians or Sydney, where numbers were down based on the success on Kangaroo Island. Is that likely to happen? Or now after the fires, is it likely that we might be looking at reintroduction from the mainland back to Kangaroo Island. Could you give a comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. Either way, but before we do that, we need to know what we're doing. And so you've got two populations that have been separated for a fairly long time. So basically what we're going to do with the support of the Department of Agriculture is look at the differences between the populations first, and see whether this is still the same species, really.
Okay, thanks for that. Next question I'll direct to Remko. Remko, these artificial nesting stalks that have been such an incredible innovation and a success, do you think that they might work for and be of use to other carpenter bee species?
Yeah, they probably do, but that's something you need to test species by species. The other green carpenter bee in Australia may want to go into there. But the other thing is that we've shown that if there's natural substrate, then they're less likely to take it. But it may be worth trying it with the green carpenter bee on the Queensland East Coast. Yep.
And again, follow up for Remko. So the yakka stalks, they get a couple of years out of them. But it takes a couple of years, and then they get a couple of years. With your artificial nesting stalks, how long do they last?
Well, if they're not used by anything else, then they may last quite long, because we build them in a way that they're sort of protected against water that comes in. If they're used by the bees, they usually 2 to 3 generations of bees, and then they basically sort of dug out the whole inside of the nests.
So is the generation a year? Is that 2 to 3 years?
Yes, so it's 3 years. Yeah.
Okay. Richard, a question for you. You were talking about how carpenter bees prefer one species of Banksia over the other. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, well, we're not 100% sure about this, but we think it's actually the structure of the plant. So the way the plant grows matters, because what the bee actually likes is tall trunks that have no side branches. So the species it doesn't seem to like as much, Banksia ornata, just has very closely opposed branches. And so when they fall off, basically you don't have a nice clean trunk. You've got lots of holes in it close together where the branches were. And it just seems like the trunks of that species don't make nice big areas where the trunk's entire and clean, whereas the other Banksia tends to. So it just seems to be something about the architecture of the plant as far as we can make out.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. I'd love to be able to ask many more questions, but I think we're going to have to wrap it up there because we're just over the time. Look, I'd like to thank you all so much for sharing with us. Thank you, not just for sharing, but thank you for really committing to this project in the way that you do, because I know it really is a love job. This is something the three of you are just so incredibly passionate about. That passion comes through, and we share that passion with you. So it's a delight to be continuing to support this project with you. Thank you so much. Can I give a little flagging? If people are interested and they'd like more information, we did 3 great little videos that you can view on the Wheen Bee Foundation YouTube channel, and they talk about the project and really show some great footage of the project and of the x-raying of the nesting stalks. So go and have a look at that. Can I also give a little plug before we finish to Australian Pollinator Week? It is Australian Pollinator Week, and we still have a number of other webinars. Obviously, people here today are interested in native bees. Tomorrow night, we've got another one, Discovering Australia's Native Bees. So, have a look at the Australian Pollinator Week website and get involved with some of the other webinars. So thank you very much. Thanks to the sponsors. Thanks to our speakers. And Naomi, if you can just bring up our closing little piece. So thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed. This is the end of our webinar.
All the birds and the bees and the bugs are a-hummin', 'cause they know that pollination week is a-comin'. Life on Earth depends on how pollination ends, so you better listen hard and help me, friends. Well, there's a special week each year for pollination, so I'm here to give you all the information. Helps the plants make seeds, make sure the birds keep feeding, and the bugs and the bees and those animals keep on breeding. Pollination's just the transfer of pollen from a plant's male to a female sexual organ. Some plants are just one sex or another, and some have found a way to be both father and mother. Oh, wouldn't that be great to self-pollinate? No wonder the birds and the bees and the bugs are a-hummin', 'cause they know that pollination week is comin'. Life on Earth depends on how pollination ends, so you better listen hard and help me, friends. Everybody knows about the hard-working bees who attend to the plants and make honey as they please. They help the plants keep seeding and the birds keep feeding. Let the bugs and the bees and us people keep on breeding. Now all the birds and the bees and the bugs are a-hummin', 'cause they know that pollination week is comin'. Pollination's vital, everyone should know about it. The health of the nation depends on plants that go about it.